When Anu invited me to this event, she said that it should not be a presentation of neat, finalized research, but rather a place to ask questions and share some issues that we have encountered in our activities. So this is exactly what I'm going to do today, to reflect on some issues that I have had in conjunction with a couple of recent projects, and perhaps even use the occasion to ask for your opinion for matters that I have not solved yet. Those pertain to our source material as researchers of the recent past. What kind of sources do we have, and what kind of sources do we construct ourselves? What are the specificities of these, and what are the ways to find most appropriate outlets for our research that would engage the subjects of our research and to do justice to them? What is our position vis-à-vis our subjects? How much agency? Again, the question of agency. But really, I think it's important how much everybody has to say on the matters pertaining to them. And how does the power balances work? The two case studies of today, they fall into the category of feminist research, but the same issues I have encountered in dealing with other, not necessarily feminist topics. And I actually believe that they pertain to all of us, because they inevitably arise due to the time frame in question, the late Soviet and contemporary periods, and due to the specificities of the Eastern European context, the assembly and use of oral histories, and the unofficial and private archival material that could be called minor archives. So as Anu mentioned, a couple of years ago, I was curating an exhibition at the Museum of Estonian Architecture. And as part of a preparatory work, I did interviews with 16 Estonian architects. The oldest at that time was 92 or 93 years old, and the youngest was 33. There were quite long talks, from an hour and a half to some cases 2 hours even. And in a much shortened and edited version, they were used for the film displayed at the exhibition as well. But inevitably making a 50-minute film out of tens of hours of recorded material means heavy condensing and a lot of choices to make. So in my mind, I started to devise it as an ongoing project, which I have to admit, regrettably, it's still on hold. But I started to think of it not just as an aid for an exhibition, but as an oral history project of its own. And this is where the issues started to emerge. I guess a bit less in art, but at least in architecture, the potential of oral history has started to be more widely acknowledged only recently. Because architecture is quite an elitist domain, and there is a very strong conviction that only the initiated ones are able to grasp it properly. And there is prejudice that the finitudes of architecture are essentially beyond the comprehension of a layman. When oral sources are used, it is most often the already well-established and mostly male heroes who get to be interviewed. And the questions asked usually follow the quite conventional narrative of design as an extraordinary oeuvre of an individualistic master. At the same time, the tradition of oral history has been strongly focused to the opposite, towards the ordinary, towards the everyday, towards the marginalized. However, I believe that oral histories can provide a very valuable supplement to the traditional methods of architectural research, because there is a potential for mending the gaps in the existing canon and to provide various counter-narratives to this high-profile mainstream discourse. From the perspective of gender, the conventional methods of architecture historical research could present specific pitfalls. Firstly, the published primary material and available archival sources may be quite biased. Internationally more, but even locally, there is a tradition that well-to-do architecture offices or architects finance the research of their own work. and publish their monographs and have attempt to control the output about them. At the same time, the archives of architecture museums and similar institutions, they are mostly based on material that is donated to them. And women architects, they often have issues with self-esteem or just humbleness. They don't often do that, which means that the collections comprise predominantly of designs of men. And if the archival institutions are able to make acquisitions of their own, they tend to also prefer the heritage of the, so to say, major critical practitioners. Means that there is always a lack of archival material about the women architects. At the same time, this context of late Soviet period adds its own specificities, because the written and published sources that we have from that time, they must also be taken with a grain of salt, harnessing the specific ability to read between the lines and distinguish between actual opinions and the ideological baggage, as we all know. And oral histories have a great potential to amend the situation, although they also encompass a danger to sugarcoat the memories with a heroic glow as well. So interviewing, it actually means not using the existing memories, but more constructing actively new sources, which means that it's especially important whom to interview and what we are choosing to ask. Much too often the interviews only elaborate on existing narratives and do not challenge enough the established canons and hierarchies. And I have to say that I certainly share the same fault. While highlighting women practitioners in itself, it meant generating a kind of an alternative, but I still chose the ones who had established themselves, who had been published, who had been decorated, and who could be considered the important ones. In this sense, the choice did not challenge the underlying assumptions about what is considered important or what is considered success in architecture. The results did produce counter-narratives, but only to an extent, and a very great number of other possible interviewees whose career trajectories were less conventional or who were simply dealing with more ordinary tasks or environments were relegated to the second echelon, which is still waiting for its time. But furthermore, the process of architecture production involves so many more agents: planners, interior architects, officials, assistants, legislators, constructors, real estate developers, critics, publishers, and of course the users. They all have a role affecting the production of the built environment, and their accounts should also be collected to investigate all kinds of conditions of architecture production, the impact of networks, of relationships, the regulations, and informal aspects of the organization of the profession. And due to the inevitable facts of life that people get older and eventually die, all this project is really urgent. The fact that in oral history projects we are actually constructing our sources, it's best reminded by the notion of intersubjectivity. And this is definitely something that I encountered during this project. The telling of memories is not a presentation of a previously existing story, but rather a narrative performance and constructing the story on the go. It has been observed that women have a different way of presenting their life stories than men. They tend to see themselves as relational selves and to present everything that they have done in relationship to various agents that have also affected the process. Women's accounts of their life stories tend to be shaped by conventions and dominant understandings of what their narratives should look like. In the context of architecture, which is a masculine field, these expectations have probably even a stronger role. And indeed, when I was doing the interviews with the older architects, I often encountered a situation that they had clearly prepared for the event, and regardless of what I was asking, they were presenting me a full, neat a proper life story of a creative architect and only a hint of a more personal side. I kind of experienced this as my failure, but at the same time, who am I to force upon them my understanding of what is important? Still, more often than not, the intersubjectivity of the constructed stories was clearly felt, because my questions inevitably involved certain assumptions and biases, and they informed the storyteller's account, confirming that subjectivity is rather in a flux. Many respondents admitted that they had never considered their lives from a feminist perspective, and that the interview prompted them to interpret their choices and actions in a way that they could not have previously imagined. It could have happened that the interview started with very strong statements, like saying that, no, I have nothing to do with feminism, and end after an hour with completely reversing their understanding of themselves. Furthermore, narrating a life story, it's not just a text, but also an event. In addition to the verbal, it has other layers of information: gestures, mimics, tone of voice, posture, rhythms, all kinds of such affective qualities. But when the interview gets transcribed, all this gets lost. Academic context tends to presuppose normalized transcriptions that flatten the authenticity of the subject's voices, even if they get directly quoted, and even more if they get critically analyzed. Which gets me to the central concern. What happens to the collected oral histories once they are recorded? And also this is a question of audiences. Whom are we trying to address, and whom are we doing this for? So from one side, the oral histories have great activist potential, especially if their recording or their use involves a public aspect. Seeing or hearing people speak up might trigger an avalanche of comments or further accounts, encourage others to follow suit, help to create an understanding that there does exist a community of forerunners, that the cases are not isolated. At the same time, the collection is an archive and should be treated as such, and to enable potential uses for future researchers, curators, and others whose interests we might not foresee yet. Thus, preserving the accounts in their most authentic manner would be in the interest of this archival aspect. However, often the researchers tend to prefer to work with transcriptions rather than recordings due to habits, conventions, and efficiency. Yet those would already be condensed and somewhat reduced versions. My second example is essentially an elaboration of an oral history project that has grown into an archive of very peculiar characteristics. From the beginning of the 2000s, interior architects Irena Timusk and Taimi Soo have conducted interviews with interior architects working in the late Soviet project. But in addition to simply interviewing them, they have also gathered photographs, graphic documentation, and previously published reviews of their works, and assembled all this material into personal folios. And by now, there are 14 such folios that they have donated, some of them to the Estonian Design Museum, and other copies to Estonian Union of the Interior Architects. And last year, I suggested the subject to a BA student of mine, who then detailed the story of assembling these folios. Obviously, this initiative stemmed from discontent with official architecture historical writing, because for a long time, interior architecture has been relegated to the margins of the more important issues of architecture, and being a domain that is less valued, perhaps for its more ephemeral character, its more contingent, and also perhaps because of the majority of the practitioners are women. This is an international phenomenon. Interior architecture has begun to receive appropriate attention for its own right only in the recent decades. Thus, the impulse of the interior architects to take the matter into their hands and start assembling archival material may be characterized as a minor archive, something that is not directly opposed to the major history, but that rather forms an interdependent symbiosis, helping to bring to the fore the character and the mechanisms of the major story. It's of course related to the concepts of minor architecture that in its turn comes from the model of Deleuze and Guattari's concept of minor literature, a critical stance that hybridizes the major and generates multiplicities instead of canon. And this is exactly the case with the project, it's not really easily translatable, people in the image. I don't know, it doesn't sound so good, but that is what they call it. It is existing outside of institutions and does not follow the procedures and conventions of archiving. It's assembled from a highly eclectic mix of sources, and the folios are not exactly built up in a similar way. Neither does the systematization and the handling of the material correspond to any academic or institutional requirements. The images and graphic material often goes uncredited, making it often difficult to understand which projects have been depicted or what are the dates and locations. At the same time, there is diverse material that pertains to personal lives of the designers and even their parents or ancestors. Some folios include audio recordings. Interviews done specifically for this project are mixed up with interviews found in earlier media, and some folios contain other people's, like children or colleagues or relatives, accounts of the protagonist. So cross-dialogues are also often formed between the designers who talk about each other. Obviously, all this challenges our conventional assumptions about what is important in the case of historical records, and reveals a lot about what the practitioners themselves have deemed important in the context of a creative life. Now my question is again, how could we make use of such a minor archive in a way that both would enable a professional dialogue with our architectural historical discourse, but at the same time would also respect the priorities and choices of the practitioners themselves? Because from the strictly academic point of view, a part of this material is clearly useless, as it's difficult to attribute and properly reference, in spite of this project being assembled, as stated by the authors, primarily for future research uses. Yet I think that the strength of this lies exactly in these weaknesses, because the project at the same time reveals a lot that its authors have not explicitly voiced, and that they are probably even unaware of it. Thus, any public display or dissemination of such material should try to convey both layers at the same time, the content as well as the construction of this minor archive. How to do that, I'm not exactly sure yet. Presenting it as an artistic project in its own right in some exhibition format might be an option, but could there perhaps be other options? Our main and most obvious outlets are usually research articles and curated exhibitions, but the curatorial practices might offer more alternatives for oral history projects and minor archives. Should there be online platforms, dialogues with contemporary artistic interventions, I don't know, public readings, radio shows, what else? I would love to see research finding more diverse outlets to engage with different audiences and to be appreciated for it as well. Thank you.